Thank you very much for coming. And I'm very, very happy that I'm joined tonight by Robert Walsh. I guess you didn't know, because it wasn't mentioned, that he is the head of the Local 40, which is the Ironworkers Union in Manhattan. He oversees the activities of approximately 1,300 workers who are sometimes working on bridges or skyscrapers or tunnels and etc. things. All of that work is very dangerous, and all that work requires a great courage, as well as a willingness to work. Sometimes we Americans, especially in recent years, think of Americans as not hard-working. And sometimes we feel that we must have more immigrants, not that I don't welcome more immigrants, but to do the hard, dirty work. But what I discovered as a young reporter, and I still believe it today as an old reporter, is that we have many Americans who are very hard-working and do the tough jobs. And one of the examples that I have always looked to for hard-working Americans with pride in their work, but working men, these are not people who sit behind computers like all of us most of the time. They get out there, and this man represents those people. And as a young man, he's in his 70s now, and I'm in my 80s now, but as a young man of 18, 19, he was an apprentice on the Verrazano Bridge, following the trade of his father, who was also an iron worker. And Mr. Walsh has two sons who are ironworkers, and they have sons who are ironworkers. So this is the dynasty of ironworkers in the Walsh family. But they're not alone. In his union, and not only his union in Manhattan, there are unions in Brooklyn. There are unions all over the state of New York. There are unions all over the United States, ironworkers, who do this kind of work. And in many cases, even now, there is within certain numbers of families a tradition of doing what Dad did and what Granddad did. And here's an example. So I'm so happy that Robert Walsh is here. And I hope I haven't misinformed the public. Tell me, here's Robert Walsh. Is it
You've
true?
done a good job.
Okay, thank you. Tell us how you, though, you didn't tell us, because I didn't tell them, your father was injured in the work. And why is it that even though you had an injury in the family, you went ahead and did what you knew was a perilous occupation? And tell us how that happened.
Well, good evening to everyone, and thank you for having me here as well. But first I'd like to say is that my granduncles came over from Ireland, and they started what you call a rigging business. It's part of the ironworkers. They moved machinery with horses those times. They also had barns that were where the World Trade Center was. That's where they had their barns for the horses and everything like that. And then my father came over from Ireland in the 20s, and he got started in the business with them. And actually, my father had got killed in the business at the News Building on 42nd Street and 2nd Avenue. We were all kind of young. My oldest brother just turned 18. I was 11. There was one 13 and another one 15. My sister was 6, and my youngest brother was 4 at the time. And it was just a misfortunate thing. The foreman asked him to work that day for him. He was supposed to come up to the Adirondack Mountains, where we were enjoying the summer. My mother's cousin had a bungalow up there, and we used to go up there every summer. We were very fortunate to be able to get away from the Bronx during the summertime. And he was asked to work that day, and he just had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was on top of a platform giving signals to put a printing press in through the News Building, and the boom buckled, and it came down and hit him, and he went down about 4 floors. So that was the end of my father's life. And what usually would happen would be the oldest son would probably start in the local too. You know, he'd get into the business. They'd bring him in right away, like, you know, and just to keep the livelihood going for the family there, you know. And he started the business. He started in the business around 56. That was in 1955 that my father got killed, and then word came about this big job that was going to be from Brooklyn to Staten Island, the Verrazano Bridge. And at the time, they needed a lot of apprentices because it wasn't really a lot of journeyman's work at the time, but there had to be journeymen there as well, but there was a lot of apprentice work.
Tell us the difference between, they don't know what a journeyman is. Tell them the difference of the cadre, the class system. It's like the military.
Yeah, well, the apprentices would start off in the first year, second year of ironworking, learning the business, and working at the same time as well as going to school. And the third year is all welding.
Going to ironworker school.
Going to ironworker school.
And tell them what they had to learn to be an ironworker?
Oh, you had to learn all about the knots and the reeving of blocks and how to splice cable and splice line. Practice on climbing columns inside the school, the steel columns that maybe some of you have seen some ironworkers going up and climbing all the way up to tops of 60, 70-story buildings. You see them doing that. And walking across the beams, how to learn to tie all the knots that we need for the job, how to hook on, meaning by putting a choker or wire rope around the beam and putting the hook from the crane into that, and you send it up in the air. A tagline man, you'd be taught how to be a tagline man as well in the school. He'd have to guide the beam up to the first connector, and then it would be passed around to the other connector. These are sometimes up, like I said, 60, 70 stories, and even more at the 110-story New World Trade 1. But you know, but you're learning on the job as well as going to school a couple hours a night. We had to go to school 3 nights a week in those days. It's down to 2 now, and there's longer hours in it. There's 3.5 hours now each night going to school, and they do that 2 nights a week. The 3rd year is all welding. You have to learn how to weld today. Like they used to use rivets years ago. I was asked if I ever worked in a riveting gang when I went to work on the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge, but I didn't. So they got a young Indian fella who was another apprentice there. He had worked with rivets before. Rivets were done years ago. They heat these rivets up in a pit full of coke, and you'd have to get them to the right temperature. They'd have to be driven into the hole where the 2 beams would meet or meet into a column. And the other fella, they'd call a bucker up. He'd have the shape of the rivet head on a bucking up tool, and then they'd hit it with a riveting gun, which was all heavy work those days and hard, I'll be honest with you.
And Robert, didn't they toss I saw them toss the rivets, they flipped them.
They'd flip
and the guy that caught them was with like a cone, like a first baseman.
Yeah, he was the catcher. Yeah,
it's amazing to see that stuff. And they sometimes missed.
The heater would heat up the rivets, and he'd toss them up with the tongs. He'd throw them up to the catcher, they call him. And he had a can. He'd take it out with another tong, stuff it into the hole. The other guy would take over, the bucker up, and then the guy with the riveting gun would start hammering the rivet to make the shape of it. Then the rivets went out. High-strength bolts came into effect. A lot easier, a lot less men. Then welding took over, so that's why they have a full third year of welding in the apprentice school today. But all those journeymen had to go to apprentice school, and they learned all the parts of the trade. And it's all rigging machinery now, jumping cranes, jumping guy derricks, kangaroo cranes. That's what's going on today.
It's, you know, in this city, we can't help but notice, no matter what neighborhood we come from in New York City, there's always this construction work going. We notice it mostly as an inconvenience. The streets are crowded because half of it is blocked by some construction work, and we have to swear at the cab because
we hear about that.
Our rates are going way up. Many of you, I'll bet, live in apartment houses that might be 10 or 12 or 15 floors or more, elevator buildings. And you know, we're talking about an illustrious project, the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge, or Robert mentioned the Trade Tower #1, that's 102 stories or whatever it is. But ironwork is done in, half of these people probably live in buildings that ironworkers had to have something to do with, if they're tall apartment buildings. And you never think who builds those buildings, that those of you who live in tall buildings, who did this? And that was the question I had in mind when I was a young reporter in 1958, 59. I was on the New York Times then, in my junior reporter, but I had access to assignments and I had bylines and all that. And I heard about this Verrazano Bridge going up, and I, of course, having lived in New York some years before, could not help but wonder how the skyscraper city's laboring force created the skyscrapers, or created the bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge. More than 100 years it's been there. And yet we have no record. even though Mr. McCullough, the great historian, wrote a book called The Brooklyn Bridge, we don't know who built the bridge. We know the engineers, the Roeblings. The famous people are the engineers sometimes. Or in the case of the George Washington Bridge, he's a very famous designer, Mr. O.H. Ammon, who incidentally also designed the Verrazano Bridge. The George Washington Bridge in the 1930s, and the Verrazano started in the early 1960s. But we do not know the guys that do what Robert Walsh did when he was young, and the people that are now part of his force, and he oversees them, who do it now. And my job, I thought, as a chronicler of hard-working people, was to get the names and the stories of these people. So this Verrazano book, of which Robert is a part, and has helped me greatly in doing this, incidentally, keeping me informed sometimes on old-timers that I knew, but he has in his office on Park Avenue South in the lower 30s, he has all the phone numbers and addresses of hundreds and hundreds, retired, maybe some cases, and active in other cases. So I went to him and looked up people whose I didn't know where they were, because I saw them in the 1960s, but when the job was done in '64, even though I kept phone numbers and addresses, some of them moved, some of them died, and I didn't know who was dead or alive. So Robert Walsh's office and his associate, Elizabeth Corrigan, who works in the same office, helped me find these people, and they have glorious stories to tell. So the book I wrote is about glorious stories. It's about people whose work actually put this towering edifice, this magnificent masterpiece, rivet by rivet or bolt by bolt, put it together, and put it together in a way that will stand forever. So these guys, Robert Walsh and his people, and people who will follow Robert Walsh and his people in the future, have aligned themselves from generation to generation with pride in work. And yet, they're usually anonymous, just like those people who build your apartment houses. You don't have a clue, unless your father helped build the apartment house. Don't have a clue, but this city is filled from one end to the other. Every of the 5 boroughs have buildings that were built at risk by people whose names are not in the history of New York. Newspapers don't mention them. And that's why I wanted, as a newspaper man, to be one of the few who cared about the work that was done, that we see. You can't help but see it. The city, like New York, is a city of towers. And here we have a man himself. So I'm very glad you're here. I said it already. I say it again. Thank you. But tell me more. I think.
Well, actually, what happened, like I started off before about the Verrazano getting started, they needed a lot of apprentices there, so my oldest brother asked me would I be interested. So I said I would. I was working at the time, I had just finished high school. I was working we were a laboring family, I'll be honest with you, all of us. And I was working in a cement factory and getting paid $64 a week for inhaling asbestos, coloring, sand, all sorts of dust and everything. But so anyway, I worked one day out on the bridge, and I got 3/4 of that just for the one day. So I says, this is a great job. I says, I like this. So I was very fortunate, I really was. And you know, so anyway, I went out to the bridge, and the first day out there, I had to get up probably about 3 o'clock in the morning because I lived up in the North Bronx. I had to take the Woodlawn Jerome down to the Staten Island ferry. Went across in the ferry, had to get a bus from Staten Island side out to the Verrazano Bridge, Fort Wadsworth. And then we had to sign up in the office for American Bridge. American Bridge was the company that did the wire and the roadway deck. And so I went into the office to sign up, same with a bunch of other young apprentices. And there was this older fella there, as an iron worker, and he sounded like an Irish fella, so I felt right at home with this fella because both my parents were from Ireland, and I grew up in an Irish neighborhood in the Bronx. So anyway, I says to him, oh, what part of Ireland are you from? So he said he wasn't from Ireland, with this sort of Irish accent. So anyway, after a couple of times, he finally told me he was from Newfoundland. I didn't have a clue where Newfoundland was at that stage of my life, I'll be honest with you. But he turned out to be a good friend of mine, and he was on the examining board when I took my journeyman's test. His name was Bill O'Keefe, and he was a very good friend of mine. So anyway, there was a bunch of us, like I said, had a sign up that day. We went down to the pier to go up in the elevator by the tower, and the tower was, this stage was about 690 feet up in the air. You had to go up in this framed out elevator, and it was just made out of angle iron with cables pulling it up and two guiding it, one on each side of it, guiding it. And there was probably, and it's wire mesh also around it. So there was one fella that was operating the elevator, and there was probably about 12 or 14 apprentices, and there was 3 journeymen in the elevator. And it was in the early part of March. It was kind of cool and breezy, very breezy. So anyway, when the elevator got full, the wind wasn't blowing through the mesh. We were blocking the wind, and it started to give a little twist around and twist around. And the next thing, it stopped. So anyway, one of the journeymen said, "Oh, hell no," I won't use the words that they said, but he said, "Don't tell me it's going to drop again," he said. You know, so trying to scare the hell out of us, like, you know, but it's just a little gag, that's all it was. So when we got to the top, after all the stoppages because of the wind, when we got to the top, there was probably about 5 or 6 guys that wanted to go back down. They didn't want to work there, so that was enough. That was initiation for them. So that was the end of their job anyway. But I was lucky enough, there was a tall Indian fella. He was in charge of a gang up there, and he says, "I want you, big boy," he said to me. And I was tall and slim at the time, and so anyway, I was working with him and his gang at the top of the Staten Island Tower on the north side cables. There was a south side. There's 4 main cables on the bridge. There was 2 south side and 2 north side. So I was on the north side, and this fellow was from Oklahoma. He had a bit of a twang, but he was an American Indian. And I must say he had some expressions, some that you can't mention here, but he had a lot of good ones. I'll tell you, you could remember them till the day you die. But so we were hired just for the spinning of the wire on the bridge. And what would happen? Do you want me to keep on going on?
Yes, the spinning of the wire, I actually saw this done. It took about 6 months to do it, didn't it?
Yeah.
And I'll have Robert explain in a more precise manner, but what you see, or what I saw, not properly named, but what I saw, what would look like bicycle wheels, about the size of bicycle wheels, aren't they?
Yeah, large bicycle wheels.
Going back and forth from the Brooklyn side to the Staten Island side and back and forth, and these wheels rolling around, almost like a big spool of thread, and the wheels are rolling around. The thread was hanging back, and these spool-like contraptions were leaving cable, but was really cable, almost like thread when you looked at it, because I saw the bridge in a way like a harp at a certain point, because the cable was about the size of a pencil. Is that about right?
Yeah, about the lead, about the size of, yeah, about the lead in a pencil.
Yeah. No, I once read somewhere that in the old days when a bridge was built across a little lake or over a pond, and the Indians built rope bridges, they'd shoot an arrow from one end of the landing and shoot it across the other, and it had wire or rope on it. Well, this process of using these spinning wheels, the process of spinning the cables, is sort of like that, except they're shooting 2.5 miles. The difference between Brooklyn side and Staten Island side is about 2.5 miles. That bridge is a whole rainbow of steel stretching to that distance. And they do it in this incredible way of wire by wire by wire, and then they get to about 60 or 100, I don't know, I mean, he'll tell you. Then they kind of clamp it together, and there are about 4 of these clamp wires that form the bridge, and they hold up all the steel, that roadway that the marathon runners run across once a year, and that trucks and cars go back and forth on day and night the whole year. And this process is amazing, but to give him a better idea, because I'm making them confused probably, but
you're pretty good at it.
Okay.
Well, what it is the 2 big anchorages. There's a Staten Island anchorage and a Brooklyn anchorage. And that's where the big eye bars are put in. They're built into concrete, big, huge concrete walls are around them. And at the end of the eye bars there's a hole to take a pin. And what happens is that's where what they call the wheel rack is when they're starting it. All the wheels of wire come in, big huge reels. Actually, there's enough of wire on the bridge to go around the world almost 6 times. That's how much wire was used. And what happens is there's a cable that was put in, and there's frames put up also to carry this cable that goes, like, it starts off at the same time. One starts in Brooklyn, the other one starts in Staten Island, and it brings a wheel from each side. The wheels pass in the middle of the bridge and just continue on to the other ends of the bridge. And it's continually laying out this wire. And you make bands of the wire. So many of it in the band, they get banded together, and they just build up in braces along the bridge, and it shapes a cylindrical type shape. After all of that was done, you had to band all the wire to make it more round. And what you actually see there is that big round cable. That's all thin wires. What that is.
And how thick is that? It's thicker than a basketball, isn't it? It's about the size of a basketball?
It's about 3 foot in diameter.
3 foot?
The Verrazano bridges, yeah.
And you have 4 of those things strung along.
There's 4 of them, yeah.
And they hang everything else.
And everything hangs off of those. But before you start hanging anything, you have to compact it. It has to get to a certain size, and then after they compact it, you have to put the red lead on it. That's what was done in those days. No more red lead. It's not too good for you. And after the red lead goes on, they wire wrap the whole thing. So it all looks like one big tube right now to everybody. That's what it looks like. And after that, they come along and they have the castings. They put the castings on it, and the castings would have suspender ropes that would go. And the cable would come up from the roadway, up all the way around the top of the casting, and then back down to the roadway again. And that's what hangs the steel. That's what hangs the steel, is those suspender ropes. That's what they call suspender ropes.
And the steel that forms the roadway that you drive back and forth on if you go between Brooklyn and Staten Island and spend $15 a ride, that road was comprised or made up of about 60 or more sections of steel, each of those sections the size of a ranch house. Isn't that right? About
yeah, kind of big.
Like a ranch house. I saw it, and there were 60, and they came down from the Jersey side of the Hudson River, floated down on barges. Each of those ranch house-sized steel, whatever they are.
Cords, they call them, a cord.
And they were
made up trusses
and then the barge stands under there, and these cranes on top of the towers, the 2 towers, each tower is 70 feet high, a 70-story building, each tower.
700, yeah.
Yeah. And the cranes, lifted that steel section. God knows, what does it weigh? How many tons?
It was 250 tons each section.
Each of these little houses.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder, Robert, how come the crane sitting on top of the tower, 500 or 600 feet above the sea, how come the crane doesn't buckle and fall over in the sea, lifting that much weight?
Yeah, what they used to have was what they called class engines. Class was the name of the machinery. And there were huge engines that the cable would come out of that, go up to the tower, and it would go around like a pulley. You'd call it a pulley, we call it shivs. And the cable would run down the shiv, it would go down the catwalk to the first opening at the center of the bridge, and there'd be pulleys all along the way where the cable would run, and it would go down to the barge, and it would hook on to the cord, the steel cord, in certain areas on the cord. And there would be one on each side, and it would lift the whole thing up. It was kind of a great engineering feat. It really was.
And amazing and dangerous, needless to say. And what he hasn't said is there are a couple of people who died, or 3. I actually knew one of them, men who died. And after the 3rd death, the head of the union, the guy who had Robert's job in those days, a guy named Ray Corbett, who himself was a famous ironworker, he went up on top of the Empire State Building and put the top of that in back in the 1930s. But this Ray Corbett looked out for the welfare of his men, and he had some opposition from the bridge companies, the people who fund these bridges and who own these bridges. In the case of the Verrazano, they thought no, we can't put nets under this thing because the nets will get in the way of hoisting that steel. Those ranch-style houses I told you, they have to come up with barges, and the net will be in the way or cause a lot of complications. Let's not do it. And Ray Corbett said, no, we're going to have nets. We're not going to have any more of these perilous circumstances, falling off the bridge or in the wind or injuring yourself if you don't kill yourself. So there's a 4 or 5 day strike. And then they finally agreed, and the bridges did have the nets under the bridge. And this young man, Robert Walsh, in those days, fortunately there were nets because he fell on 2 different occasions. Tell them about your happy days of falling.
Well, at the time when the cords would come up, you'd have to bolt up all the bolts that would get put on top of them for the floor beams, for the roadway deck. And I was in the bolting up gang at the time, and like I said, I was an apprentice then. And you'd be carrying bolts, nuts, and washers out to the points where all these men were bolting up all the rest of the steel beams. And the beams were probably 5 foot apart. And I used to jump from one beam to the other beam with the basket in each hand. A bit of a show-off, I suppose, at that time, you know, but today I wouldn't be doing it, that's for sure. But I just happened to miss my step, and I was lucky enough for Ray Corbett, thank God for him. I'm able to tell the story that I landed in one of the nets there, and I'm here to tell the story. I was one of the lucky ones, that's for sure. But, and then another time I fell on the lower roadway. I fell about 18 feet and landed across an inspector's walk across my chest, and I broke a couple of ribs, but that was all right. I was all right after a while. So I was very fortunate there, I really was.
These guys who do this kind of work, I think of almost in the area of high-level professionalism sports. You know, you guys watch football, and especially if you watch the NFL. These guys are injured, broken ribs. Sometimes there's a terrific quarterback from San Diego. The quarterback is Rivers, I forget what his name is. He's been playing with broken ribs I read in the sports page today. Playing with pain, these guys. Well, these guys do the same thing. They're like athletes, and they have a sense of belonging to a team. And
if we get hurt on the job and we're out of work, we don't get paid. Those guys get paid.
They don't even get paid if it rains. I mean, even when they're healthy and wealthy and wise, they still, if it rains, you go back and play cards with your wife or something like that.
Or on the job, maybe.
On the job. Do we, who's in charge here? Anybody? You want to ask some questions? Can they ask questions? I don't want to be driven out of here without questions being asked. Sure. Are we time for questions? Huh? Well, anybody wants to ask Robert a question, or me a question, or both?
Who sponsors these journeyman tests?
No, they join the union. It's a union job.
He does.
Yeah.
Oh, the union is in charge of that.
Yes.
Ah.
They fill out an application, just the same as any job, and if they get accepted, they go to apprentice school. They have to take a test. They have to take a drug test,
and the
physical.
Is the school run by the union?
Yes, it is. Yes. Yeah.
If somebody wants a job?
We spend a couple of $1 million a year in educating apprentices in our international union. Yeah.
Over here's a question.
How the people in the neighborhood felt?
He asked a question, this gentleman asked a question, who are the people in the neighborhood? You mean the Brooklyn neighborhood? Yeah. Before the bridge was built, before Robert Walsh and those other people were in action, there was a lot of grumbling, particularly in the Bay Ridge section, Brooklyn. And I actually was a reporter, I told you before, on the Times, and one of my stories was go out and cover these people that are really angry and hear their gripes and quote them, and they had really a whole protest movement that's comparable to, I guess, what you saw some years ago, the Occupy Wall Street people. And these people had a legitimate gripe, but because Robert Moses, who was a big guy in that time, you all surely know him, know of him, I mean, he was a great builder, and he had a great idea, big ideas for a big city. And he needed this bridge. I mean, people had to get to Staten Island better than just by ferry or rowboat. And but what he had to do, or what had to be done, Moses surely believed, was built this great pathway to the bridge on the Brooklyn side, the roadway, getting to the toll gates. And as a result, every house was in the path of where this was going to lead. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were going to have their homes and stores destroyed, and public buildings and churches are going to be destroyed. And boy, they surely didn't like that, and they were just giving an edict. You're going to have to move. We'll find you another apartment or find you another house. But you know how comforting that is. If it ever happens to your satisfaction, it's a wonder. However, what could they do? They were powerless. But boy, they were not silent about it. They were very noisy. And this protest went on for months and months, but got nowhere. Inevitably, they were forced to move. And grumping and grumbling, they did move. And I kept in touch with some of them after the bridge was partly built and they had located in wherever they had to be pushed to be relocated. I kept in touch, and overwhelmingly they were very unhappy where they had to live. There were some few, I have to say, that later on said, you know what, I actually am glad I had to move, because on my own I wouldn't have moved. I was familiar. I liked the comfort of familiarity. But some of them who did move into better quarters, got to be in a better neighborhood, and they were happier. But after a long thought process, were they happier? That's about it. Any
but a lot of those people from Brooklyn and Bay Ridge are in Staten Island right now, so they're on the other side of the bridge. So.
Yeah, a lot of retired ironworkers, I know.
Yeah, there is, yeah. Yeah, it's the truth, yeah.
Find a journeyman.
He wants to know what defines a journeyman. Yeah, you ought to explain that.
That's somebody that's served an apprenticeship for 3 years. He might even serve it for longer, because he mightn't have been able to get into school on the first try.
It's like a sergeant. Would the apprentices are like...
You graduate.
Like a non-commissioned officer of the highest rank of journeyman?
I'm sorry, Gay.
Would you like a sergeant? I mean, it's almost like the Army. You got these levels, the punk, or the apprentices, sometimes called punks, to the lowly guy. Intern, if you're in the corporate world. Then you get to that level of the journeyman, and it's like being a non-commissioned officer, like a sergeant. And then you get higher. Then you have the walking boss, the pusher. That's like a lieutenant.
Pusher would be a foreman that's in charge of the
guy like Hard-Nosed Murphy, who was the big boss.
Well,
he was like a colonel, wouldn't he be?
Yeah, he was like the general.
General. He walked up and down.
Yeah.
And he actually had colonels under him, because he had wasn't there about 4 major ironworkers who two on this side and 2 on that. They walk back all day long, walk back and forth, criticizing the guys like him.
And they'd have to report back to Murphy, this Hard-Nosed Murphy. That was his nickname, yeah.
You know, I just heard today, that Hard-Nosed Murphy, who's dead, a great character in this book. I love that guy. He's a real, ever made a movie, it's a great part for an actor. But I heard that his son, I don't know what his first name is, worked on the World Trade building.
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
I didn't know that. Somebody told me that. I'm going to check it out. Maybe Elizabeth will check her files when we get...
A big difference in pay?
Between a journeyman and an apprentice and a superintendent? Yes, there is a big difference in pay, yeah. What happens is a fella that's in charge of a gang, he'd be called a pusher. He'd be the only person at that level.
The guy was arrested. Some Indian was a pusher, and somebody heard in Brooklyn, this is a pusher, and the detectives went after him. They thought he was pushing drugs. You remember that there was? I mean, I knew that story. I think it's in the book. Anyway, a pusher is the name.
The pusher was in charge of that crew of journeymen and an apprentice or 2, and he'd be on what you call straight time, a straight 40-hour salary. So if it rained, all the fellas in the gang would be going home. He'd get paid for the day, because it's the responsibility. And for years and years and years, all he got was $1 more an hour, but he did get straight time. Now they get $3 an hour more. Then above him is the walking boss. So they'd be making their own deals with the superintendent to get so much money. They'd have to get their going rate, that's for sure. And whatever they got on top of that, that's fine as well. You know, we'd have nothing against that, as long as they got the going rate for the job he had. And the superintendents, they'd be the big guy there, and he'd make his own deal with the company, you know, and that's why he's with them, because they know he knows what he's doing as well, you know. So, but John Murphy was his name, but they called him Hard-Nosed because he was a bit of a character.
A guy named Bill Connor called me. You remember? And you know, I don't know if you know Bill Connor. There must be 25 Bill Connors in your union.
Yeah.
But he said, heard Murphy was working on the World Trade Building, the new one. Yeah, any other questions? Over here got a question.
Yeah, could you talk a bit about whether the ironworker communities that used to exist, like in Brooklyn and stuff, those little enclaves, still exist, and how the community works now?
Well, actually, years ago, there were a lot closer knit families and relatives and everything like that. Actually, the American Indian, they had an area in Brooklyn there. There was a bar by the name of the Wigwam they used to have there. And all the Indians, there was a lot of Indians in our business. And actually, there was a good few in our local as well, and we still have a good few. And they come down from a place, the old name of it was Cognawaga. It's Kanawahi, they call it now. They sort of made it a little easier to say it. Up in Canada, outside of Montreal. They'd come down every Monday morning, early Monday morning, they'd come down, they'd go to work, they'd go to sleep that night and go out for a couple of drinks, I suppose, a bunch of them. And
they had apartments in Brooklyn.
They had apartments.
And then
they lived in boarding houses in Brooklyn as well. And then on Friday afternoon, they'd head back up to Canada. It's kind of a tough job.
At great speed. One time I went with these guys. There's a guy I knew named Danny Montour. He was a terrific guy and very friendly. And I got to know him after watching him work and having a drink or two at the Wigwam. And he said, you know, you want to come up some weekend? I said, sure. He said, how about next weekend? Fine. And so I met him after 6 o'clock. I was at the Wigwam, and he had 2 or 3 other people. They had a big car. It might have been a big Buick. It was a big old car. It wasn't the cram, because there were 4 guys, me and 3 others. Monto was driving, and I was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 guys were in the back drinking. They bought some bottles from the Wigwam bar. Coke, yeah. And they went up, I don't know how long it took. It was about 6 hours to get from Brooklyn to this place on the St. Lawrence River, this reservation that Robert mentioned. And so I spent the whole weekend there. And I saw many retired ironworkers there. And they were, all they talked about was bridges and projects. You know, even the retired people, they weren't nostalgic about it. They were connected to the young men. Or they might have been the sons or the grandsons of the young men. And it's a whole world. They're like circus workers in a way. You know, how insular is the world of the circus, how insular is the world of the baseball player, how the baseball player travels teamed around the league, and they spend their summers and then in spring, and then in the winter they can't wait till spring training, because they're athletes. I don't think are very good family men. You read terrible stories in the papers today and yesterday about the football players abusing their wives, or alleged abuse, all this stuff that goes on supposedly. I just think these guys shouldn't be married. No athlete should be. And you know, and they're like, and maybe ironworkers shouldn't be married. Although he's married, but they're into the world of men. It's a different world. It really is.
Well, the problem with the American Indians is that they're away from home all the time. And the problem with it is that there isn't enough of work up there to keep them all working. So they have to travel. Now, they just follow the work wherever it's busy. A lot of them, the majority of them love to come to New York because of the wages are the highest and best in New York.
What could they make a week?
How much can they make a week, she asked?
An average vine.
Yeah, what's an average guy make? If it's not too raining, if it doesn't rain every day?
He can make $47.50 an hour. And also $65 an hour in benefits, which would include an annuity.
The average iron worker?
If he works a day, that's what he's going to get for a day.
Almost $50 an hour?
Well, he's going to be making more than $50 an hour. Yeah, he's probably going to be making about $120.
Sounds like
it sounds like a lot of money, but his health coverage is there as well. He has an annuity fund, a topping out fund, and a vacation fund included in that. And also, he contributes into a scholarship fund for his children as well.
But he doesn't get anything if it rains.
He gets nothing if it rains. You know, so when you get hurt, you get the same as a rainy day.
Hi. Just incredible courage these guys had. The story on James Braddock is unbelievable.
Oh, the old working with Robert and all those other guys in the 1960s was a former heavyweight champion. James J. Braddock, was that it?
Yeah.
He was. I saw him one day. I didn't know who he was, but he was a guy behind a crane, just a big guy. And someone said, "Hey, that is the former heavyweight champion, James Braddock." Boy, did you know him?
I met him once or twice out there, that's all.
I like him more now, knowing that he helped put up the bridge.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Let me ask you, you were doing these articles about the bridge in the beginning with the Times. Was it your intent in the very beginning to do the book, or did that evolve later?
That evolved. The question was, when I was writing these articles, I was writing a lot of articles about the development of the bridge from the early stages through the more complicated stages that Robert Walsh described. I must have written 10 separate articles to the very last article, which was the parade when the bridge was finished. But before that last article, about a month before, I wrote an article about the completion of the bridge. And the bridge was so beautiful when it was finished, and nobody was on it. It just sat there in the sunlight or in the moonlight. A work of great art, a massive work of art, and no cars and trucks and pollution and no toll gates, no money, nothing. Just sits there.
At the time, we were calling it the ninth wonder of the world, I'll be honest with you, because it was really the largest bridge in the world at the time.
And then they had these parades, and Robert Moses, you remember mentioned it before, and Mayor Robert Wagner and Governor Nelson Rockefeller and all the dignitaries and the executive class and the captains of the steel industry. Everybody was there, but who was not there? Ray Corbett wasn't there. This young man wasn't there. None of the ironworkers were invited to the party. So in this book that I wrote, I actually wrote this book after the bridge. This book that's in the stands downstairs somewhere is not a new book. It's a 50-year-old book. It's just been reissued on the 50th anniversary. But my idea then and my idea now as an old man myself is to call attention to those who were not invited. These are the guys that did the work, not Governor Rockefeller and Robert Moses. He didn't lift a finger. The fingers were these guys. Okay?
I'm invited this Friday. Thanks to Gay Talese.
Yeah, that's right. Finally, they got around to inviting.
And two other fellas by the name of McKee. And
are they invited too?
Yes, they are.
McKee, yeah. I didn't explain this because it was one of the two men McKee are in their 70s, living in Staten Island too, as you pointed. They were formerly in Brooklyn. They moved, but one of their brothers, Gerald McKee, fell off the bridge and died. He fell off from, I don't know whether it was during the cable spinning or not. It might have been later.
It was after the cable.
They were putting up those links we talked about. Fell about 500 feet, hit the water, no chance. It's like hitting concrete. It just body broke up, and that was the end of it. And it was terrible. And I think that's probably what got Mr. Corbett saying no mas. I mean, this is over. So that's when they got the nets. New question here.
Mr. Talese, what was it like when you first went up on the bridge? Were you afraid? Was it?
I was asked the question, what was it like when I went up on the bridge? Was I afraid? Sure, I was afraid. He mentioned American Bridge was one of the companies that provided this steel, etc. And I had to get clearance from the public relations director, and he's all right. I was doing these pieces for the Times. I wasn't doing a book. That came later. But I was doing pieces for the Times, and he gave me a hat, which I wore, AB, American Bridge, which everybody wore. And I didn't wear boots or anything. I just was dressed in a suit and tie as I always am. I'm a son of a tailor, so I never change my style, no matter who I'm interviewing.
And very neat all the time as well.
Yeah. But there was an elevator. Remember he mentioned, I went up that same crummy little elevator. I thought you got to... And I got to the top, and the top was the top of the Brooklyn side, the tower, 70 stories high. And then you lowered into walking this catwalk, which strung the whole length of the bridge, 2 miles, 2.5 miles. And more than catwalk, when you're walking the catwalk, you really, it moves around, and you really feel, you have something to hold on to. But it's just a wire. You know, it's not a banister, it's a wire that you hold on both your hands as you walk. And I thought, Jesus, how do you, I mean, I did a little bit of it. I want to get a feel of it, but not too much of a feel of it that I want. I did it a couple times, and I met there was an old lady. It's a man's business. It's an old lady that was around, and she too sometimes went up there, and she had a pad, a sketch pad, and her name was Lily Rethy. I think she was from Vienna. She's about 65 years old at the time, and she was sketching the bridge workers as they worked on these various aspects of the construction. Beautiful line drawing, pencil drawing. I wrote a story about her for the New York Times, and I wrote a story about Hard-Nosed Murphy, and I wrote a story about the great designer O.H. Amen, and I wrote a story about all those, the Indians and all that stuff. And then I got to the end of it, and Jesus, this is really interesting stuff. I want to do more. So I called up somebody I know in the book business, and he saw my articles in the Times. He liked them. He wrote me a letter, in fact. I said, why don't we do a bridge? A story in the bridge. So we did. And I wrote that book for Harper and Row in 1964 when the bridge was completed. And here it is 50 years later. And I'm still here. And he's still here thanks to the Nets. Thanks to the Nets.
And Ray Corbett.
And Ray Corbett. You know, he was, that's right. Thanks to. Any other questions? Back there, that guy.
I have one question, and it's about the planning. When it was in the planning stages of building the bridge, was there ever talk about putting in a pedestrian bike path?
You answer that question.
And if so, why didn't it happen? And do you know if that's a possibility for the future?
You know, I was asked that question not too long ago, and the answer I gave was one word: bitch. Keep on bitching about it. It'll eventually come, I'd say, you know. Just keep bothering people about it, honestly. You know, it's a lovely spot to go across if you could walk across it even, you know. On the George Washington Bridge, they're going to make a whole new pedestrian walkway and a bikeway across it. They want to keep everybody away from the towers. That's what they want to do. They're afraid of somebody planting a bomb or something like that at the towers. That's exactly what they're afraid of.
One more question. Question, that lady there.
I'd like to know how it felt to go back into that book now. How it felt to go back into that book now. How it feels.
I feel I'm not assuming that I'm sharing with ironworkers the sentiment about returning to the bridge site, but just as a writer of the bridge, I felt a proprietary interest. I felt it was part of me. Now, it's pretty vain of me to say so because I'm not Robert Walsh. However, I am a chronicler. I'm a storyteller. I'm a talebearer of the bridge and the people who built the bridge. And every time I see the bridge, I remember what it was like, although it's the same bridge now. I mean, it looks like it did the day it was finished in 1964, November 22nd. It hasn't aged at all. Only we have aged. He's aged. I've aged. And a lot of his pals have aged, but I feel what I've heard these men say, and I'll let Robert say his own story about this. They have enormous lasting pride in being part of something grand and necessary. A bridge is necessary. It changed the economy of Staten Island. It's changed the economy of Brooklyn. It's done with all the complaints about the people who were kicked out of their houses, etc., which is not a good story. However, there is a good story, and that's how life has been enlarged because the bridge brought a section of one borough to the other borough, Staten Island to Brooklyn, Brooklyn to everywhere else. But I think that they look at the bridge, these men, well, let him tell me, you look at the bridge and what do you feel?
Well, it's a lot of pride, that's for sure, for the work that you've done it, and great satisfaction as well, and nice to be able to tell your grandchildren that you worked on that bridge and you helped build it. But like Gay was saying, there's a great deal of pride in the work that we do. Not just the bridge, any of the buildings that we worked on, you know. You drive down the streets in New York and you say, oh, I worked on that one. That's another one I worked on. You know, it's great satisfaction and pride in it. It really is.
And you know, through Robert's office and Elizabeth Corrigan, who have access to all the names and addresses and phone numbers of people, old and new, in the bridge building business, I went into his office about, I don't know, 6 months ago. And I wanted to check somebody who was named Eugene Spratt, S-P-R-A-T, Eugene Spratt. I knew him. And he said he's dead. Robert or Elizabeth, somebody. They looked in the computer. They had, well, I don't. He's not alive. But then Robert said, but he has, in his computer, he seemed to have a son or a grandson, a guy named Joe Spratt. And there was a guy named Joe Spratt, but he's dead too. He was the guy that was the son of Eugene Spratt. And this Joe Spratt worked on the big building over the Madison Square Garden, Penn Plaza. Was that what it's called? Penn Plaza. He's dead. But there's another Joe Spratt. He doesn't want to be called Joe Spratt Jr., but he is Joe Spratt Jr., but he calls himself Joe Spratt. And he's 28 or 29. He went to college, a football player, went to college, dropped out of college. He wanted to go back to the line of work of his grandfather and his father, Joe Spratt. And he had the phone numbers. I called this Joe Spratt. And I said, "What you ever come in?" And he lives in Staten Island. His girlfriend teaches school out there, and he's about 28, 29. And he had just finished working on the new World Trade Center, and he was part of the gang that went up to put that antenna up there. I mean, it reminds me of Ray Corbett putting the damn antenna on the Empire State Building in 1933 or whatever it was. So this guy, Joe Spratt, agrees to come to town, have dinner with me someday, some night. He's a nice, robust kid, looks like a football player. And he told me, I said, what was it like going up there at the World Trade Center, this new one? He said, well, I get up there and, you know, with a lot of guys who, like me, had fathers and grandfathers in this business. And we get up there, way up there, and you can see the whole city. And as I looked to the south, down the Narrows Hudson River, I see the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. That's where my grandfather, Eugene Spratt, worked. And I turn around, I look uptown, I can see the big building over the garden, the Madison Square Garden. That's where my father worked. And he said, other guys were doing the same. And he said, when we look around from that high distance around the city of New York, we see a family tree. I thought, God, so wonderful. These families, they found the towers of New York are, with these guys, a family tree. And boy, that's a real prideful thing, isn't it? Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you again.